So I work with Garnet Connections Landscape Partnership Project that's funded by the Lottery Heritage Fund. And the project is based in southwest Scotland, and so as part of Garnet Connections, I assist with the Go Wild and Garnet project to organise training events just like this one, so you can develop skills in species identification and feel more confident about getting involved in wildlife recording. So we've organised this event in partnership with the Scottish Wildlife Trust's Irvine to Girvan Nectar Network project that Lynn coordinates. And Lynn is looking for volunteers to train up over the coming months to get involved with surveys for the Nectar Network. And she'll tell us a bit more about that just at the end. So we're really pleased to welcome Anthony McCluskey, who runs the Helping Hands for Butterflies project with Butterfly Conservation Scotland. And he's been really kind to put this presentation together for us because he's very busy doing a lot of courses on butterflies and their wildflowers. So I'd like to just hand over to him now and he'll get started.
Yeah, thanks, Emma, and thanks everybody for having me along today. I'm just going to start sharing my screen. This is part of a project called Helping Hands for Butterflies, which is funded by the National Lottery Heritage Fund and by Nature Scot. And as Emma mentioned, I belong to a charity called Butterfly Conservation. We're a UK-wide charity which was founded in 1968 with a mission to conserve butterflies, moths, and our environment. And we undertake that in a number of ways by taking practical conservation work, promoting the scientific study of butterflies and moths, safeguarding the important sites, and a large part of my job is around the public enjoyment of butterflies and moths. And just a quick introduction to butterflies and moths. They belong to a group called Lepidoptera, which just means scaly wings. And if you look at the photograph here, you'll see on this peacock butterfly, all those little scales come together like pixels on a screen to make up the patterns. There's around 180,000 known species worldwide. And in the UK, we have 59 butterfly species which are resident or regular migrants, and over 2,500 species of moth. But butterflies and moths are in danger, and we've lost 4 species of butterfly and over 60 species of moth in the UK during the last century. And our latest report on that found that in the last 40 years, 3/4 of UK species of butterfly had declined in their range or their abundance. So on the whole, they are declining. And this is mainly because of changes to farming. There's agricultural intensification, including the use of pesticides and fertilizers, which has just meant that there are fewer wildflowers in the landscape, which has resulted in declines in butterflies and bees and other insects. Then within our woodlands, a lot of our woodlands are really dark places now, so the woodland butterflies are just getting crowded out. And other types of habitat loss included almost half of our broadleaf woodlands, 200,000 miles of hedgerow. We've lost 95% of our lowland raised bogs in the UK. We've lost most of our elm trees because of Dutch elm, and now ash is being affected by ash dieback. We've lost 98% of our flower-rich meadows, and now we're also looking at the effects of climate change and pesticides. So it seems to be that they're getting it from every angle, and it's been described as death by 1,000 cuts. So we need to do all we can to help these insects. But butterflies and wildflowers, wildflowers are essential to the life cycles of most of our butterflies. They get most of the food from plants, and they've evolved to exploit plants as well as they can. So for example, in some situations, the emergence of butterflies is timed to coincide with the optimal stages of their life cycle. For example, orange tips emerge in spring just as cuckoo flower and garlic mustard are coming into flower, and those are the 2 main caterpillar food plants for the orange tip. So you can see the female lays her eggs upon the developing flower stalk, which will turn into a seed pod, and then the caterpillar eats those. But if she had emerged too early, then the plant wouldn't be developed enough. But if she emerged too late, then the seeds would have fallen. So in many situations, butterflies and moths have evolved to emerge just at the right time when the flowers are doing their best thing. In some situations then, caterpillars are really well camouflaged against certain plants. Here is a grayling butterfly caterpillar, and you can see how well camouflaged it is against the grass that it's eating. And here's a northern brown Argus caterpillar, really just tucked under the leaf there that it's also eating, so it's green and hairy, just like the leaf that it's feeding upon. And in some situations as well, butterflies and moths can actually use certain chemicals from plants that they feed upon. This is a 6-spot burnet moth, and it can absorb cyanide from plants that it feeds upon, including birdsfoot trefoil, and it uses this to poison any predators, would-be predators, and that's why it's so brightly coloured. It's a warning to predators not to come near it. And then the other caterpillar here is a large white butterfly caterpillar. These might be your nemesis if you've ever grown cabbages or kale or broccoli. These are the ones which can really decimate those, but they actually absorb certain oils from these plants, which they use to make themselves taste really bitter. And then if a bird or another animal attacks it, it gets these kind of really awful mustardy taste, and it kind of deters other predators from trying to attack it. So the fate of many butterfly species are closely linked to wildflower communities, and now we're going to have a look at some of the commonest wildflowers you're likely to see and the ones which are most relevant to the butterflies you're likely to see as well. And we'll start with birdsfoot trefoil. So this, it's a really common plant. You'll find it in various open, sunny and dry habitats, and that can be wildflower meadows, coasts, uplands, and even in brownfield sites, so waste sites. And it's really distinctive because it's covered in yellow flowers at the ends of stems. So you can see the yellow flowers just grouped here with a little stem coming from the plant itself. But it's quite a low growing plant, only to about 40 centimeters. So it really can't compete with some of the taller grasses. So you'll find it in some more of these open situations. And the word trefoil then refers to the groups of 3 leaves that you'll see around the plant. But the bird's foot name then refers to the shapes of the seed pods, and you'll see just here that these are the seed pods developing, and it kind of looks like a bird's foot, like these claws on it. So that's how it gets its name. And the most similar plant to this is one called greater birdsfoot trefoil, which is found in damper places. But this is by far the most common one that looks like this. But it's really important because it's the caterpillar food plant for the common blue butterfly. So anywhere where you see birdsfoot trefoil, it's always worth having a look for the common blue butterfly, which is our only widespread blue species in Scotland. And it's also the caterpillar plant for the six-spot baronet moths, and you can see it just emerging from its cocoon here. So birdsfoot trefoil is a really useful plant for caterpillars, but also for adult insects, and bumblebees especially will favour it. I should say, no, I can't see anybody, but just in case you're writing anything down and you're trying to take notes or anything, this will be recorded and sent around afterwards, so you can go back through it and have a look at it, so don't worry about it taking too many notes. And then staying with the pea family of plants, we'll have a look first at the vetches. So vetches, you'll hear vetches or vetchling mentioned, and we'll start with bush vetch. So this is a very common plant in rough grassland, and you'll also see it on hedges and places like that too. And it scrambles over other plants. You can see that it's got tendrils at the end of the leaves like this, with these little fine leaflets as well. It uses these tendrils to climb over other plants, so you'll see it crawling over grass and things like that. So what you're looking for with bush vetch, because it looks very similar to some of the other plants we're going to look at, are the rounded edges to the leaflets. So the leaflets are all along here. There's a number of them, and you can see they've got very rounded edges just there. And the flowers themselves, you can see here in the photo as well, the rounded leaves again, but the flowers themselves come directly from the main stem. So there isn't like a stalk with the flowers coming off. They really are contained all along the stem. There are 2 to 6 flowers per inflorescence, and the flowers themselves are purple to pale purple in color. Now, another common and similar plant is called tufted vetch, and you'll find it in similar situations to bush vetch, also scrambling over plants, forming dense mats. But what we're looking for with this plant is the fact that it has, the leaflets are more numerous for a start, but also they're more parallel sided. So they're not as rounded as those of bush vetch. So they're kind of longer and thinner. But the flowers are quite easy to separate too, because they're held on spikes. You can see the spike itself coming up here with all of the flowers coming off it, whereas in bush vetch, all the flowers are coming from the main stem. And also there are more flowers per inflorescence, as you can see here. So those are 2 of the commonest vetch species, but we'll also look at some of the less common ones which you're likely to encounter anyway. This is bitter vetch, and it is found again in a variety of different habitats, usually in more acidic soil. But what you're looking for with it are the vivid pinky purple flowers hanging from short stalks. So you've got the stalks coming, and they're usually held over. They're not upright, so they're held over like this, with these really bright flowers coming off like this. and there's 2 to 6 flowers per inflorescence, and the stems are very different as well to those other vetches. They're what's called winged, so you can see the round part of the stem, but on the outside of it you'll see like a little flap on 2 sides, so this is what's referred to as being winged. And you have larger leaves as well. So you got these really long leaves, which are very similar to the peas which you might grow in your garden and sweet peas. So they're very different leaves to those of the other vetches we've met so far. And then you have Meadow Vetchling. So again, it's within the pea family, found in rough grassland, meadows, and hedges. And it's another scrambling plant. And what you're looking for with it are the fact that you've got yellow flowers on a long, sturdy stalk like this. This is very much unlike the bird's foot trefoil, which we met already, where all the flowers were at the top of the stalk, and it was a very short stalk altogether. So it's quite a different plant if you were to compare them together. And their leaves are also quite different too. So you've only got 1 pair of leaflets per leaf, and the leaves themselves are quite large, quite long, whereas those of birds with trefoil are much shorter. And staying with the vetches, this is a really important one for a butterfly called the small blue. It's called kidney vetch. And with this one, you get yellow flowers surrounded by white woolly hairs. So let's have a look at that. We'll have a look in closer detail here. So you can see the flowers themselves, they're yellow, but they're all contained in these masses at the ends of stems with these leaves coming out from the flower mass. So it's kind of fringed by these leaves on really sturdy, thick stems. And the leaves themselves are curled. You can see the sides of the leaves there, they're curled upwards. But you really only find kidney vetch in coastal areas or chalk grassland or in very rocky places. So you might find it in bings or derelict sites like that, or in quarries, anywhere where it's very open and rocky. And you can really see the white hairs on the florets here. And it's the caterpillar food plant for the small blue butterfly. And you can see a little egg of the small blue there. And the small blue is the UK's smallest species of butterfly. And while it's mostly found in Scotland around the east coast, as you can see from the sites here, there's a single site in Irvine, and this is because the small blue became extinct on the west coast of Scotland, and we're part of a reintroduction project to reintroduce the small blue to the site near Irvine. Now, it wasn't seen for a few years after being introduced, but I think it was spotted last year and possibly the year before in very small numbers. So that's at the Scottish Wildlife Trust Reserve at Gales Marsh. So if you're there this summer, it's definitely worth having a look for this butterfly. Don't be looking for a blue butterfly though, because it's actually mostly very dark. So it's quite dark in appearance with a few blue scales, and the undersurface is quite pale blue-gray with these black dots. So look for it on really sunny days, usually in June, late May and into June would be the flight time for the species. And staying with the pea family, we're on to the clovers, and this is the only one I'm going to feature today, but it's red clover, and it's very widespread in Scotland through meadows, verges, and other grassy places, and it's the only widespread pinky red clover. The next one would be zigzag clover. It's very similar, but it's much less common. So if you see a flower looking like this, it's a fair chance that it's going to be red clover. And you'll often see these pale V-shaped marks on the leaves too. Red clover is also regarded as being something of a bumblebee superfood. The proteins that it makes in the pollen are very high in amino acids. So where the rarest bumblebees live, we find that those places tend to be rich in red clover. So it's an essential plant for sustaining those populations of bumblebees. And it's a good one to look for in meadows. And you'll see butterflies taking nectar from it because butterflies don't eat pollen. Now we're on to a different family of plants now called the carrot family or the umbellifers. And typical wild carrot is quite typical of this family, and you usually have like an upturned umbrella shape at the top of a long stem. And you can see that typified here with almost the spokes coming out from the stem with white flowers at the top. Now, this is a very difficult family of plants to separate. Some of them look very similar and can only be told apart from tiny differences in the flowers or in the seeds. But what you're looking for with wild carrot are the fine leaves surrounding the flower head. So you see these little leaves coming away just here. You'll have parsley-like leaves along the bottom. So if you've ever grown carrots, you'll know what the leaves themselves look like. Don't be looking for a carrot though. Most of the roots don't look like this. And sometimes you'll also see a single purple flower in the center. You can see it just in the illustration. A single purpley red flower in the center often gives the wild carrot away. But whenever they have finished flowering, they actually begin to close up and it looks like an urn shape, just as these ones at the top. So this urn shape also gives the wild carrot its distinctive appearance. So these are the main features that you're looking for. And they flower from June until August. Staying with the carrot family then is a very different plant. It's much smaller, so it's called pignut. And it's one of the smallest plants in the group, only growing to about 50 centimeters tall and usually much less. And has very fine leaves. If you've ever grown dill in the garden, it's very similar leaves to that. So, really very fine, almost fern-like leaves. And you get it in a variety of different grassy habitats, but it's absent from acid soils. And it does make a small underground edible tuber, which is how it gets its name of pignut. But it's a caterpillar food plant for the chimney sweeper moth. And that's a species which flies during the day in early summer, often in very large numbers. So if you see a little black moth flying around in very large numbers around the pignut, it's a fair chance that it's going to be the chimney sweeper, which gets its name because it's completely black with these little white edges to the wings, as you can see in the photograph here. Now, cow parsley is also within the carrot family, and this is one of the ones which is very common on road verges. So you see it on almost every road verge in the country, on river banks as well. However, it's very easy to confuse with a poisonous species called hemlock, so just be careful around it if you're not sure. But some of the features you're looking for are the fact that it's tall for a start, so it can grow to over 1 meter tall. It has fine hairs on the leaves and stems, and the stems themselves are often grooved with purple stripes, but never purple blotches. If it is purple blotches, it's hemlock, and that's the poisonous plant that you need to avoid. It's one of the earliest plants in the carrot family to flower, usually blooming in May. So if you see a really large white flowered plant like this in May, there's a fair chance that it's going to be cow parsley. Now we're on to a different family, which includes the mint, and this is a plant called self-heal. So you'll probably have actually come across this in your lawn because it is a plant which can survive ready mowing and constant mowing. You get it in a range of open, grassy, dry spaces, so in your garden lawns, meadows, pastures, and derelict sites as well. But what you're looking for with this plant is that it's fairly low growing, only to about 50 centimeters. And you can see from the bottom photograph that can actually almost flower at ground level. Here's one which has been walked over a lot, and you can see all the leaves at the very bottom at the same level as the soil, and the little flower stalks themselves have stayed very low, and the flowers are coming up here. And you have flowers facing in all directions. So you can see on the top photograph, the florets, which are all held in this little head, are all facing all directions. So it's quite a distinctive plant and one that you'll probably see on your travels this year if you're out doing any surveys. And thyme is actually also in the mint family. So we only have one species of wild thyme found throughout Scotland. And you get it in areas of short grass and full sun. So it's another plant which can't compete with other taller growing plants. So you'll often get it growing in these hummocks over rocky areas where the grass can't grow. So you'll also get it on rock ledges and on rocky highland streams as well as coastal sites. And it forms these hummocks. So you can see here, it's formed this hummock here over the grass itself. When you're looking at the flowers then, there's the flowers are pale lilac-y pink, and the leaves themselves are very small and round, so only a couple of millimeters across, and no other plants. There are a few other plants like that in Scotland, so but don't be expecting it to smell or taste strongly of thyme because it doesn't. So don't expect it to be like the thyme we would use in cooking. And thyme is a really important nectar source for insects. It flowers in mid to late summer, so you get lots of butterflies and other insects feeding upon the flowers to get nectar and pollen from them. And same with that family then, there's another plant which you're more likely to find in slightly shaded areas, especially woodlands and in areas where the grass grows taller, and it's called bugle. You might also know it as ajuga. So a bugle, when you're looking for it, you're looking for short spikes of pale blue flowers with purpley green leaves. So you can see here, the flowers are contained all around the stem. They're pale blue like this, a really vivid color, but the leaves, especially the lower leaves, tend to be a green to purple color, as you can see in this photograph here. It flowers very early in spring, usually coming out around the same time as primroses, and you can get it in anywhere where you get a wee bit of shade, so woodlands, hedges, and in damp grassland especially. It's a really important nectar source for some of our rarest butterflies, including the pearl-bordered and small pearl-bordered fritillaries. So it's a really good one to look for butterflies on in springtime. Now we're on to a different family of plants now, and we're on to the daisy family. And so the typical one for it would be the Oxide Daisy. You get it in dry grasslands, coasts, waste grounds, and other disturbed places. So the Oxide Daisy is distinctive because you've got these really large flowers, so they can be even up to 10 centimeters across sometimes, and they're held singly. So there's one flower per stem, as you can see in this photo, at the end of long stems, which are quite sturdy. There's other daisy-like flowers such as chamomile and mayweeds, but they have feathery leaves, whereas the Oxide Daisy has much less feathery leaves. It's a good nectar source for butterflies and hoverflies, and not so good for bumblebees, unfortunately. Staying with the daisy family then, we're on to knapweed, and this is common knapweed, which again is a very common and widespread plant. You probably have seen it before. You get it in anywhere where you get grass growing, you'll very often find knapweed, so that can be in verges, in meadows, and so many different places. But it's really distinctive because you have these bright purple flowers on the top. So all these little florets are actually packed full of food, which the insects can feed from. But you have a hard head right below the flower, which is covered in these brown, hairy scales. So one of the common names for knapweed is hardhead. So this is how it gets its name. It's quite a distinctive plant. There's nothing really else like this. So there are many flowers per plant held on tough stems. As you can see here, you can have many hundreds of plants with all their florets poking up like this. And as I mentioned, it's an extremely important source of nectar and pollen for insects. And here's an antler moth. And when I watched this antler moth, it was there for about at least 5 minutes, going around every little part of the flower and sucking nectar out from all these little florets, which all contain nectar. So it's a really important source of food for insects. Then there's greater knapweed, which is a much rarer plant. It tends to be mostly coastal in Scotland. The main thing with it is that you're looking for longer outer florets like this, which is unlike the common knapweed, which we've seen already. And the lower leaves tend to be mostly divided. And again, it's not that common in the wild now, but it's being contained in more wildflower seed mixes. So it's going to turn up in more places, especially where people have been planting wildflowers. So you're more likely to see it nowadays. And staying with the daisy family, then we're on to yarrow. So yarrow, it's a very widespread plant as well, especially dry soils and disturbed places. What you're looking for with yarrow are flat heads of small white flowers. So you can see here, you've got very flat heads and you've got white flowers with their white petals, but they're quite grey in the middle. And if you look at the lower leaves, especially, they tend to be fern-like, so they're quite weak, the leaves themselves, but have these strong stalks, which puts up the yarrow flowers, and they grow to about 30 centimeters in height. Now, we also have sneezewort, which is very closely related to yarrow. It has similar flowers, but the individual flowers are much bigger. So you can see here, they're much bigger in size, and they tend to be farther apart. So with yarrow, they're all very close together. And in sneezewort, you can see the individual flowers here are further apart. And it prefers wetter habitats. So just keep that in mind that yarrow tends to be dry places and sneezewort tends to grow in wet places. And thistles are really important sources of nectar as well, and they're very similar in appearance to the knapweed, which we've seen already. And we'll start with marsh thistle, and as its name suggests, it prefers wet places. And with marsh thistle, you're looking for these long, straight stalks going straight up like this. And you have these rosettes of leaves at the bottom, which are very prickly. And if you look at the flowers themselves, they tend to be small, reddish purple flower heads only at the tops of stalks, but you have many flowers contained in it. So you can see here the main flower, but with many little flowers coming out from around the sides. But it has such really fine spines, so it can actually look hairy in comparison to some of the other thistles. And it prefers damp places. But if you look at spear thistle then, this is another common one. It has thicker stems, and the flowers themselves tend to be fairly single, so you don't have many little flowers coming off from the side like you have with marsh thistle. You have these really large single flowers at the tops of stems with very long spikes like this. And they're quite bulbous in appearance. But probably the commonest thistle will be creeping thistle, especially around farmland or in disturbed places. And it's one of the ones which is considered as a weed because it can get into people's gardens, and it's much more likely to be troublesome for some people. The flowers then, they're a paler purple appearance. So if you compare that to marsh thistle, for example, they're very pale in appearance, and they tend to be at the end of many branched stalks. And overall, the leaves are quite different too because they don't have as many fine hairs on them as marsh thistle does. So those are three of the commonest thistles, and they're a really important source of nectar for insects. So if you have them, try not to weed them out because they are feeding the insects and doing a good job. However, one of the another plant which is considered as a weed and is within this family, this daisy family as well, is called common ragwort. It's very widespread in rough grassland and on waste ground and roadsides, and you can see huge masses of it sometimes with just yellow going forever where the ragwort has come up. This is because this plant contains a toxin which can cause great harm to mammals which eat this plant. So if there are grazing animals such as horses or cattle, if they ingest this plant, it can damage their liver. So it's a plant which is regarded as a noxious weed, and at one stage it was removed from farmland because it's so dangerous. But it's also dangerous to us. So if you are ever pulling ragwort up because you have a horse or another animal, for example, don't touch it without gloves because the toxins can go into our skin. But what you're looking for with ragwort are tall plants with straight stems and bright flowers that are close together. So you can see here the individual flowers are quite close together, which helps you to separate it from similar species such as Oxford ragwort. Even though ragwort is dangerous to mammals, insects love it. So you will get many insects feeding from the flowers themselves, but you'll also get the cinnabar moth caterpillars feeding upon it. And this is a cinnabar moth here. So it's so brightly colored because it's using the toxins as well. So it eats the plant, takes the toxins, and it will use those to poison any would-be predators of the caterpillars. So you can see whole plants covered in these sometimes, and you can see the adults flying during the day. The adults are distinctive because they're the only moth with this appearance in Scotland, where it's mostly black, which shines in the sun, with a red line down the sides of the wings. And then when it's in flight, you'll see that it opens its wings and it's got these beautiful red wings whenever it's in flight. So it's a really nice one to see. Now we're on to a different family of plants now, but the only one we'll be looking from in this family is called yellow rattle. You might have heard of it before because yellow rattle is a hemiparasite, and this means that it gets gets a part of their food from other plants. And yellow rattle does this to grasses. So it puts out its roots and it takes nutrients and water from nearby grasses. And this is really important in wildflower meadows because it reduces the vigor of the grasses and allows more wildflowers to grow. So it's one of those plants we often put into meadow mixes whenever we're trying to establish a meadow. So it's got a distinctive appearance with these bright yellow flowers. It's hard to describe the shape of them. So this is the shape here. You can see the entrance to the flower there. And they often have quite a bulbous appearance just behind the flower. The leaves look serrated and they don't grow very tall. So even though they can grow up to 50 centimeters, usually they're much smaller than that. Whenever you see the seeds then, they have these papery seed pods behind the flowers. So these papery seed pods contain the seeds, and that's how you get the name yellow rattle, because they can make quite a lot of noise as you walk through a meadow with yellow rattle in it. The only similar plant to this in Scotland would be greater yellow rattle, which is only known from a couple of sites. So if you see a flower which looks anything like this, you can be almost sure that it's yellow rattle. And then we're on to another slightly difficult family. These are the sorrels, and it's difficult just because it can be really hard to see them among photographs because they're usually covered in grasses. They don't grow very tall at all, but they are related to the docks. So you might know the docks or dockins, which are considered as weeds. These are the kind of smaller cousins of those plants. So we have common sorrel, first of all, which is found in grassy places, verges, riverbanks, and other habitats. And it has these roundish leaves like this, and they tend to be bright green. And if you look just at the back of the leaf, you'll see that it's just kind of has these kind of spurs which point backwards, and there's not really else a lot to say about this plant, except that whenever it flowers, you'll see these reddish green stalks of flowers coming up, which again are similar to those of the Dawkins, but it grows much smaller, so only to about 30 centimeters tall are the actual flower stalks, whereas the leaves remain much closer to the ground. And you can just see in the illustration there with the spurs to the leaves point backwards only. And that helps us to separate it from the next plant, which is sheep's sorrel. So again, this prefers more acidic grassland and is more prevalent in the uplands and in disturbed places. And the leaves are much smaller for this species. They only grow up to 4 centimeters in length. And I couldn't get a good photograph because it really is difficult to get a photograph of the leaves of these plants. But if you look at the lobes at the back of the leaves, they spread outwards, where it's in contrast to those of common sorrel, where the lobes just point backwards. So just so you know, that's the main difference between those two plants. But the main reason I'm talking about sorrel so much is because they are the caterpillar food plant for the small copper butterfly. So if you see those plants, you know you should be looking for small coppers. Now, small coppers, they're a brightly coloured small butterfly, which are fairly widespread in Scotland. They're really absent from much of the kind of central highlands here, but around the coasts and in urban areas, they're a bit more common. But they need certain conditions which can hold them back sometimes. They need these really sunny, warm spaces, and they prefer places with rocks and gravel where they can bask. So they're really wanting these disturbed sites with places where they can bask. And the thing with small coppers is that you very rarely see them in large numbers. You might see 1 or 2 or even 3 or 4 per site, but not very many at all. This is because they're territorial, so males will chase away other small coppers and other insects away, which is why they're very rarely seen in large numbers. It is a species that's declining in Scotland, though, so if you do see the small copper, it's one that you can report to us to let us know that you've seen it, because it's really important that we know more about the distribution of this and other species. And now we're on to a different family of plants called the Brassicas. So this will include your garden cabbages and kale and plants like that. And the distinctive thing about that family is that they all have 4 petals in the flowers like this. So they're often known as crucifers as well. So the Brassicas all have these 4 petals. And Cuckoo Flower is also known as Lady's Smock, and it gets its name because it emerges around the same time as the arrival of cuckoos in spring. So that tends to be May, and you can get whole road verges and hills and kind of wet meadows covered in the flowers of Cuckoo Flower. You can see them here. They have these pale lilac colored flowers, and you get it in damper places. So that tends to be damp grassland and road verges. And you can see the little stalks just here with the flowers at the top. But this is a really important caterpillar food plant, and you'll see the following butterflies using it. That's the orange tip, green veined white, and small white can all lay their eggs upon cuckoo flower. So it's a really important one for those species. You can actually look for these species by looking for eggs. And as you can see, the orange tip eggs are orange in appearance, and they're laid on the seed pod, but will be the seed pod. It's the flower stalk just here. So you can actually survey for that species by simply looking for these eggs. Another plant in the same family is called garlic mustard. Now, garlic mustard is not related to garlic at all. It just happens to smell of garlic, whereas it's much more closely related to the actual mustards. You can get it in hedgerows and other places with more light close to trees. So I tend to find it at the woodland edges and in hedgerows and places like that. So what you're looking for with this plant are the nettle-like leaves. As you can see here, they're just like nettles, but of course they're not stinging at all. And they have these little flowers very small flowers at the end of long stalks. So you can see the flower stalk here and the little flowers just there. And if you want to be sure, you can crush the leaves and they'll smell of garlic, which tells you that it's garlic mustard. And again, it is also the food plant for those white butterflies, similar to the other cuckoo flower we've seen already. Now we're on to a different family of plants now, which includes ragged robin. So ragged robin is a really beautiful plant which flowers in early summer. You get these pink frilly blooms and nothing else looks like it. So you can see here, it's almost as if somebody had designed like frills on these flowers. You can see really long petals with these frills coming off and bright pink in appearance. And you'll find it in damp meadows in full sunlight. So you can see it growing among rushes. So all around here, you see the soft rush growing around with the stems of ragged robin coming up around it. And it's a really fantastic sight to see. You'll get insects visiting it for nectar. So butterflies and moths and bees will visit it. And similar plants, and in the same family, are red campion and greater stitchwort. So let's look at these. Red campion tends to be found in places, in various grassy places. So it's quite a vigorous plant. So you'll get it growing in many different habitats where there's a bit of sun. And it has 5 petals, which are heavily divided, so they actually look like 10. So similar to the ragged robin with the color, but you'll see these rounded petals, and they're divided almost to the very bottom. There are only 5 of them, but they look like 10 because they're divided this way. And the leaves are hairy and paired. So there are no other plants like this in Scotland which look just like this with the pink appearance. So it's an easy one to remember. Then greater stitchwort is in the same family, but it's a very different plant altogether. But it has a similar feature in that it has 5 petals, which are very divided. So again, it looks like it has 10 petals. And this tends to be mostly found around hedges and other places like that. So you can see it growing here through the nettles with these really bright white flowers like this. You got really weak stems though, so the stems will droop over the other plants, and yeah, so you'll find it in places like hedges where it can get a bit more light. And another campion then, so if you're in any coastal areas, look out for this. It's sea campion, so it's in the same family as red campion and ragged robin, but it grows in a very different habitat. So it's almost entirely coastal, but you can also get it in alpine places, but it's very low growing. So it forms these cushions of bright green leaves, which stay very close to the ground, often growing over rocks. But the flowers are large and white with these really large bladders behind them. It's quite a distinctive plant. You really wouldn't confuse it with anything else. So sea campion is one to look for on cliffs and kind of rocky places like that. Now, dog violet, there are other violets you'll find in Scotland, but this would probably be the commonest one. It's easily identified because it has these blue, typical violet flowers, which you might be familiar with because they're similar to the garden violets, and it has these heart-shaped leaves, just like this. Now, it's mostly found in woodland and hedgerows, but you'll also find it in grassland if there's shade from taller plants such as grasses or from bracken. So do look for common dog violet in some of those different places. There are other similar violets, as I mentioned, but in wooded areas especially, common dog violet is by far the most common. But the reason I'm bringing up this plant is because it is one of the most common, it's the caterpillar food plant for some of our rarest butterfly species, including the pearl border fritillary and small pearl border fritillary and the dark green fritillary. So these 3 species can all lay their eggs upon violets. So if you see this plant growing in a sunny position, such as a really sunny hillside or in a woodland glade, do look out for these butterflies, which fly mostly in May and June. Dark green fritillaries come out slightly later in summer, but if you see anything like this, do try to get a photo because these are some of our rarest species and we're after more records of them. Now, harebell is also sometimes known as the Scottish bluebell, but it's not related to the normal English bluebell at all. And it's related to the garden variety campanulas or bellflowers, which you might be familiar with. There are other campanula species in Scotland. Some of them are naturalized garden escapes, but it's the only species which looks just like this. So it has these pale purple-blue flowers that mostly face downwards at the ends of these very thin stems. You can see how thin the stem is just here, and they don't grow tall at all, maybe to about 30 centimeters in height. And as I mentioned, then you've got these very thin flower stalks. You get it in a range of habitats, including uplands, lowlands, and coastal, but never in damp ground. Then meadow cranesbill, it's scarce in the wild in Scotland, but it is more common in coastal areas. It's related to the garden geraniums that you can get, and it can be found in good quality meadows and in verges. So what you're looking for with meadows cranesbill are the large pale blue and sometimes purple flowers like this. So they all have 5 petals and it's very blue or purple in appearance. And they're quite large, so they can be 4 centimeters across. It can grow quite tall as well, up to 80 centimeters in height. And if you look at the seed pods, that's how it gets its name. So they're long and thin, just like a crane's bill, like the bird, the crane, like the bill of a crane. So that's how these plants get their name. And the leaves of this plant are deeply divided. You can see here like this, which helps you to separate it from some of the other cranesbill species. And ladies' bed straw then, so it's the only bed straw we'll look at today. There are other bed straw plants which are mostly white flowered and they're quite difficult to separate, whereas ladies' bed straw is distinctive because it's the only common one with really bright yellow flowers like this. So you get it in dry grassland, road verges and upland meadows with dense sprays of tiny bright yellow flowers. So this is a typical appearance of it here. You can see the Oxide Daisy growing slightly taller than it, so it doesn't grow very tall. You can see it here before the flowers open. You can see it growing amongst the red clover here. So it is quite a low growing plant. And if you look closely, you'll see that the flowers have 4 little petals just like this, but they're held in these huge masses, which gives it an overall striking appearance. And the leaves then, if you're looking at those, they're very fine and dark green. So the leaves are, very thin and fine, just as you can see in the illustration here. And coming on to one of the final plants then, this is thrift, and it's mostly coastal in Scotland, but it is spreading inland in places wherever you get, especially where roads have been salted, because it seems to be restricted mostly to coastal sites. So the salting of the roads has made suitable habitat for it in other places. And it's really distinctive plant because it's got these globular heads of pink flowers contained at the ends of these really sturdy stems. And the leaves then are really grass-like, so they're very short and just grass-like. So there's really nothing else that looks like thrift, so it's an easy one to identify. And it flowers quite early in the year. So that's just a quick run through of some of the flowers you're likely to see when you're out and about this summer. However, I definitely recommend getting a guide. These are just 2 of the guides that I've picked out because I know that they're smaller guides. They're not the really large books which contain all the species. They're just the ones which you're much more likely to see. And if you're a beginner with wildflowers, I'd recommend getting either the Collins British Wildflower Guide or the Scottish Wildflowers written by Michael Scott. So try to pick up one of those, and they're really handy for just putting in a rucksack, and they don't take up much space at all. Now, if you're out and about this year and you want to record butterflies, I'd recommend going and downloading the iRecord Butterflies app. It's a free app for Android and Apple devices, and all you have to do is search for iRecord Butterflies. You can use this to send in single records or sending in multiple species records as well. You can do that too. And there's a free ID guide in it as well, which has pictures of all the UK butterfly species. And whenever you're sending in a record, it has the most likely species for your area. So you're likely to see those first, and it can really help you begin to identify the butterflies that you're seeing. So I'd recommend doing that because it means that records get to our verifiers and they get onto the national database, so it helps us to see where the butterflies are. Now, if you want to find out more about butterflies, you can join me on any of these free butterfly ID workshops coming up this month. These are the dates for them, but I will send them around after today. So I'll ask the organizers of this event to send these around. They're all being held through Zoom from 10 o'clock until noon. And you can register using the web address there, but I will send it around to everybody after today so you can book your space. So thank you for listening to that. Hopefully that was a good introduction to you for wildflowers. I'm just going to stop sharing my screen and I can take some questions from the audience. Thank you. And just to let everybody know as well, I've been running a wildflower workshop over the last month or so with 5 workshops to try to cover many of the wildflowers I talked about today. So in that, I can spend much more time with them, and I will be putting all of those workshops on YouTube. So there's going to be 5 workshops which appear on YouTube. So I can maybe send those out as well whenever they're all online, because you'll get a lot more detail and it'll be a lot less rushed than what I was kind of doing today, which was a crash course really in wildflowers today.
Thank you so much, Anthony. That was excellent. Before we go, I just want to we mentioned right at the beginning about trying to get people interested in surveying, and if you are interested, then We have, we're looking for volunteers, Urban to Govern Nectar Network. So any volunteer surveys, you don't need to have done any at all. We're training you up. This is part of one of the sort of workshops, if you like. So if you are interested, if you live close to the coast in Ayrshire, please drop me an email. I'll put my email in the chat, lbates@scottishwildlifetrust.org.uk. And we're looking for people to help come out and basically monitor all pollinators. And it's a very simple method. And we're going to be doing some training over the next few weeks with that.